Welcome to the LDA Podcast, a series by the Learning Disabilities Association of America. Our podcast is dedicated to exploring topics of interest to educators, individuals with learning disabilities, parents, and professionals to work towards our goal of creating a more equitable world. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the LDA Podcast. I'm here today with Harold Jordan. Harold Jordan is a nationwide education equity coordinator at the ACLU of Pennsylvania and also the author of Beyond Zero Tolerance, Discipline and Policing in Pennsylvania Schools. Harold also serves on LDA's professional advisory board. So Harold, thank you so much for being with us today.
Happy to join you to talk about these important issues. I should add that I came to this work as a parent, and actually my activism on school issues goes back to my youth. So I come from a family with a lot of teachers, administrators in it. I was an active advocate as a parent. My kids went to public schools K to 12. And I've done a lot of work on education policy over the years, including in more recent years addressing issues of school safety and the misuse and overuse, inappropriate use of police in schools. I've authored a whole bunch of other, reports and studies on those issues as well. But basically, I'm somebody who cares about equity and fairness and kids being treated fairly. And I come to learn over the last decade or decade and a half that some of the problems with equity have a particular impact on students with disabilities and students of color with disabilities, which we'll get into today.
Definitely. Well, we're so excited to have you and your expertise and to delve into this topic a lot further. But before we get too far in, would you be able to tell us what the school to prison pipeline is? What do we mean when we say that?
Well, the school to prison pipeline is a term that was coined several decades ago to explain to the public and to people in school communities this phenomenon of young people getting involved in the justice system, the criminal justice system, through something that happens at school, either during the school day or on school property or school related. Especially to call attention to the fact that the numbers of young people who have some contact with the justice system through a school-related incident have gone up dramatically in the last couple of decades, in the last 25 years. And so that's the original idea. So I think it's important to think about the school to prison pipeline in a way that's both literal and a way that's both a metaphor. So it's not always the case that kids go directly from school through arrest and to prison. That is one pathway for some young people. But what the school to prison pipeline also refers to is this notion that you put large numbers of school students out of school under a broad range of reasons. And therefore, you take them off the educational track through the use of out-of-school suspensions. Leave aside for a minute the issue of arrests increasing in schools. But what has historically over the last 30 years increased dramatically is the use of out-of-school suspensions in a broad range of circumstances, in too broad a range of circumstances, I would argue. And so even though the result was not always prison or youth detention or anything like that, the result is kids being thrown off the path of finishing education. So you'll find that schools that have tougher discipline policies and discipline policies that are vague and that are used quite broadly are ones where kids are less likely to finish school or less likely to have even if they finish school, so less likely to have a sort of a successful conclusion to schools or to excel in schools. And so that also places them in a category of folks that are more likely to have some contact with the justice system later in life, as soon as 6 months after they finish school. In fact, the largest school discipline study ever conducted, was of 1 million high school students in the state of Texas, where their records were sort of tracked over a 6-year period of time. And what it showed is that being suspended from school, especially repeatedly, contributed in the immediate sense, I mean, within months, to kids having some contact with the juvenile adult criminal justice system.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up the different sides of the school to prison pipeline, and we'll be diving into both of those. But I wanted to ask, why does this school to prison pipeline disproportionately impact students of color and students with disabilities? Those are the main groups that we see that are disproportionately impacted. What factors are at play?
Well, we've always known that certain forms of discrimination that you see in schools disproportionately impact certain students, whether it's stereotyping or the denial of opportunities in the sense of not being not being exposed to classes like algebra and things like that, which we know are tied to success, especially to post-secondary school success. That is not a new revelation. What we have come to understand through research and data confirms the personal experiences of many young people, and that is that this kind of punishment is heavily skewed. So that today, the student who is most likely to be suspended out of school, especially repeatedly, or to be arrested, is a Black male student with a disability. That's going to be true in most of the states in this country, with slight exceptions for states with large indigenous students. Some of the Western states with large indigenous students populations, and some of those states, those students are more likely to be suspended or arrested. So that has been true for some period of time. It's just now that we've come to document that. And I think there are a number of factors that go into it. Some of it are just good old-fashioned stereotyping, implicit bias or explicit bias. We see that reflected in studies that have been done of sort of like who, for example, there are studies of early childhood educators that look at which types of students they tend to observe more carefully than others. There's a famous series of studies that looked at at which they were showing a film, and the educators were told that in this film, some of the students will exhibit difficult behaviors. And so the study itself tracked the eye movements of early childhood educators. And as it turns out, there was no difficult behavior in the film, but the educators were more prone to watch the Black students than other students in the schools. So we know that even from the early years on, and these are educators that have worked with very small children, that there is some kind of a suspicion and some kind of in some cases, bias, whether it's conscious or not. We also know that with the growing involvement of law enforcement in schools, and that's been one of the major school discipline trends of the last couple of decades, that just the numbers of police and the roles of police, and the fact that the policing models that are common in schools today have police being there on at least 2 or 3 days a week, so that police are in the halls, have much more interaction with students. We actually know that when that is the case, those students are more likely, Black students in particular, are more likely to have interactions with those officers in schools. And just this summer, the Government Accountability Office, summer 2024, came out with a study that took a close look at that. And they concluded also Black students and students with disabilities are more likely to have contact with police, and they actually are more likely to go to school where there are police, even if you control for the level of gang activity and other levels of violence in the school or in the nearby community. So certain students are more just likely to have contact with police in their everyday schooling experience. And so there are a number of different issues there. When it comes to students with disabilities, as it turns out, the categories of disability where Black students, and especially Black male students, are heavily represented are ones where the discipline is most harsh. So if you look at something like emotional disturbance, which is one of the categories under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, as it turns out, Black students and Black male students in particular tend to be overly assigned to that category. And as it also turns out, that is the category where discipline is the most frequent. And you could track that to the level of the number of days that kids are out of school. So a Black male student with disability is not only more likely to be suspended, they're more likely to be suspended for a larger number of days. So if you look at kids who are suspended 5 days or more, they're also likely to be Black male students with disabilities who are classified as emotional, is having emotional disturbance as their official sort of classification category. There are lots of things going on here. I think that one of the issues is the failure to provide services, supports, and protections that kids are entitled to under both IDEA and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. There's the growing use of law enforcement. There are other kinds of biases. I know that biases, in addition to the ones I've talked about already, such as adultification bias, the assumption that Black students, and this is a problem for both males and females, the assumption that Black students are older and more threatening than others, so that they're less in need of protections that are traditionally granted to young people who are teenagers. And so they're treated more like they have the capacity to understand the consequences of what their actions are versus white kids of the same age. So there are a number of different contributing factors to all of this.
Well, and I want to return to police and schools later, but I want to talk right now about suspensions and how harmful it is to implement discipline that removes students, especially students who could have a learning disability and who are already struggling in school. Why is it so harmful for that form of discipline to take place?
Well, we know that from the research that in terms of every measure of success or opportunity, that these students are disadvantaged. Less likely to finish school, less likely to complete school successfully, even if they complete school, more likely to develop a negative relationship with school, more likely to have the sort of discontinuation of education. There are, at this point, many studies that look at that. And that document this problem. So what happens in schools really has an impact on your life. And when you're talking about large numbers of kids in different communities, they have an impact on that community, including future employment, not just future education, but future employment.
Yeah. Well, and I'm not sure how popular this has been or if you've caught wind of it in Pennsylvania yet, but some schools, there have been reports that they utilize off the books or informal suspensions where they're not officially recorded. So why are these off-record suspensions so problematic, and how can they especially violate the rights of students with disabilities?
Well, there are many situations in which students are just sent home, but it's not recorded in the school records. And in many cases, parents are not told that their children are being sent home from school. So they're just saying, just go home for the day and go on. And that's, I think, the kind of thing that people mean when they talk about off-the-book suspensions. Clearly, it's not a problem everywhere, but it's a problem in certain school districts more than others. It's a problem in DC. It's a problem that's been documented in some other places as well. And if you don't track a potential problem, then you can't address it. That's the problem with often. And it also means that those students cannot use the sort of due process that they are entitled to. Almost every state has some provision in their education code which says something like this. If a kid is going to be suspended for X number of days, they can go to a hearing, have a meeting, give their side of the story, see what the evidence is against them, appeal it one step up from the principal to the school board, etc. And that's what's referred to as due process. But if the suspension is not on the books and the kid is just sent home, then they can't utilize this sort of due process to be able to talk about what actually happened. And the one thing we know about schools and about teenagers is that oftentimes what you see when you see a behavior that you don't like in the hallway doesn't completely tell the whole story. In other words, there's often something behind it. And I know from many years of working with young people and working in schools that For example, sometimes the kid who's disciplined is the kid who's the victim of bullying. But it's sort of, but if you just look at what happens in the hall, if that kid finally sort of pushes back or defends himself, and you don't have a kind of process where you can sit down and talk about what happens, and I'll call that due process, then you don't find out about what's going on in the school environment that is a contributing factor.
Well, and can we talk a little bit about the prevalence of school staff shortages, especially right now after the pandemic, especially school counselor shortages? How can that impact discipline practices in a school?
Well, the federal government, the U.S. Department of Education, has been collecting data on the number of sort of professional staff members of different sorts that are in public schools or schools that receive public funding, and that includes counselors, psychologists, social workers, and school psychologists in particular. That's the category that I look at the most because I think in some ways those are the professional staff who are best equipped to work with students. Um, and we know from sort of national data, nationwide data, and from state data that in most states, um, there is a shortage of those staff in schools. So if you look at what the professional organizations in those areas, for example, the National Association of School Psychologists, what they recommend as the right ratio of school psychologists to students, you'll find that most of the states in this country, and even within those states, there are really extreme pockets, are sort of understaffed with those kinds of adults who can work with young people. To be a little bit more specific, the current recommendation from the National Association of School Psychologists is that there should be one school psychologist for every 500 students. That's the current recommendation. And what you'll find is that there are only really a small handful of states, maybe about 4 states in the country, where that ratio is met. So that gives you some sense of the problem.
Definitely. Well, and I wanted to talk about in the presentation you had sent, you had included an example where a school did not have a school nurse, but instead had a police or resource officer. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the prevalence of police officers and resource officers in school, how they're starting to fill these roles that are typically occupied by school counselors or nurses, and how that impacts the school to prison pipeline.
That's a really important topic. We know from working with the federal data that is collected by the U.S. Department of Education that there are many students in schools where they see a police officer every day, but there is no counselor or nurse or school psychologist. And we know that that is a problem. There are some estimates, nationwide estimates, of the extent to which that's a problem. But let me just say, it's a serious problem. If you compare the commitment of schools to having police officers in school that are not adequately staffed in other ways with other adult professional staff, it is a serious, serious problem. And it is not always the case that schools see the police officer as a substitute for a professionally trained adult. But in fact, they use them that way. And when they are there, they are the adults that are dealing with young people. You will find that administrators and teachers and some other school staff will often send a young person to the school resource officers, which is another way of saying police, or will send the police to deal with a cell phone violation of things like that, that are really not traditionally policing matters. It's not the same as trying to deal with a situation where there's some kind of really heavy duty assault in a school. But you find police officers interacting with students about a wide range of issues that come up in schools, and that's how they are used in schools. And in fact, when you look very carefully at why students are arrested, to the extent to which that information is available, and I would say that, we have done a study. We did a study of Allegheny County, which is Pittsburgh and the surrounding counties. They came out in January 2022 when we looked at why kids are arrested. And as it turns out, less than 1% of the reasons for arrest have to do with weapons or having a weapon in a school. But you'll find large categories for other things in schools. When you look at the data from Los Angeles, you'll find that a large number of the situations in which police are called to intervene are things that are really kind of like social or personal or social behavioral issues that are not appropriately handled by police.
So even when these resource officers or police officers in school aren't arresting students, which we know can have very negative long-term consequences, some school police will still issue a citation for students, like you were just saying, for minor infractions. Um, is this a better route to go, or how is this still harmful?
It is not. Now, every state has a different law when it comes to, the sort of legal implications of receiving a citation. But let me break it down to you very quick, very, very simply. A citation it looks like a traffic ticket. It's actually called a non-traffic citation in Pennsylvania, and it literally looks like a traffic ticket. The idea is that in minor matters, things like disorderly conduct, vaping, small things, that police can just write a ticket. The problem with that is the ticket orders you to appear before a magistrate judge. And in Pennsylvania, it's completely outside of the juvenile system. So you don't have the protections of a juvenile defender. You don't have the protections in terms of your future records and things like that. It's a magistrate and an adult court. That's the way it works in Pennsylvania. It's different in different states. So in essence, because those young people don't have the protections that they would have in if they were in the juvenile system, they have what is potentially an adult record for something that is minor, what is minor to the point that kids would not be arrested ordinarily for those behaviors. And they're kind of in a catch-22 situation. So if they don't plead guilty and they're found guilty, they'll have to pay fines and fees. And if they don't meet those conditions, in other words, if they don't pay the fine, then they're put into the juvenile system. And I think this is a harmful practice. I think it is one that schools could end by just administrative fiat, by saying we're not going to allow our police to do that with kids in schools. We're not going to punish kids this way. So what that means is that kids have early contact I mean, by at a young age, contact with police and the justice system for things that are just really minor, that are considered by schools to be minor.
And how can this sort of negative interaction, whether it's a citation or something as extreme as an arrest, how does that impact a student's future from there?
Well, the legal impact is different in different states because every state's the law is different in every state. But in Pennsylvania, it becomes an adult criminal record. Now, you can apply later on if you've met the conditions that are handed down by the judge. You can apply to have your record cleaned up, which is a process in and of itself that would normally, you're more likely to be successful if you hire a lawyer. But, I would ask most people don't understand the implications of this, so they may walk around with these citations and find out years later they're still in a record. And also, if you are asked whether you've ever been convicted of a crime, because it came through the adult system as opposed to the juvenile system, the honest answer to the question would be yes, whether on a college application or for a job. So unless you get that record expunged, if you were to answer the question honestly, it would be yes for something extremely minor for which a kid is not ordinarily arrested. It's a bizarre feature of our laws in Pennsylvania and in some other states. In my mind, it raises a larger question about, what kind of adults should be in the room? What kind of adults should be working with young people?
Mhm.
And it also raises the question of whether anybody ever bothered to get to the bottom of, what actually happened in that incident, or whether it's something that should be punished in that way. With vaping, things like that. Is that the way that you do address those issues in schools? And I would say no. From what we know in general, not just in schools, is that early contact with the justice system tends to feed future contact.
Well, and then I have one more question for you, Harold, before I let you go. And it's a broad one, but what are some things that we can do to help make schools a safer and more equitable place?
That's a big question.
Yeah,
And let me tackle it from different angles.
sure.
I think one is that you have to have a fundamental commitment to being fair, to students and their families. And by being fair, I mean being sort of equitable in terms of how you treat them, and make sure that you're not treating different kids who do the same thing differently, based on their background or color or gender, etc. I mean, there has to be a fundamental commitment to fairness, so that you're not arbitrarily punishing certain students more than others who do the same thing. And we know that that is a widespread problem in schools. The second thing is that it's important to make sure that kids and families provided the services and supports and protections that they're entitled to. And in this case, we're talking about entitled to under IDEA and Section 504. We find often that discipline takes the place of a manifestation determination, or takes the place of an adjustment to the agreed upon support program for those kids, the individualized education plan. So a lot of times the overuse of punishment is a reflection of failure to provide services and supports. I think it's also important to reduce the use of law enforcement in everyday matters in schools, not just to have a statement in your code of conduct that law enforcement officers are not involved in discipline, but to actually operationalize that, to say, these are the kinds of incidents for which it is not appropriate to have law enforcement, and we will establish rules so that law enforcement is not involved in this, and schools are not supposed to call law enforcement around that. And actually, a few school districts have actually done that. I think that would help the situation. I think continued training on things like bias, implicit bias. And I think within a school community, it's important to look at the data. The data tells you something. It may not tell you why certain things are happening, but it'll tell you who it's happening to. And it will give you some clues as to, what the situation is. I mean, the schools collect data. I mean, they know where incidents tend to happen, what part of the building, what time of the day. Schools can even tell whether there are certain teachers who tend to refer students to the front office more. And in fact, on this last issue, there has been some research on this. And what is found is that if you look at front desk referrals, in other words, kids who are sent to the front office, most likely to be disciplined, you will find that there's a racial difference there. That white students tend to be referred to the front office for behaviors that are objectively measured. In other words, for example, cigarette smoking. Black students tend to be referred to the front office for behaviors that are, sort of subjectively measured: disorder, disrespect, things that you can't really put your hand on in terms of a specific behavior. So we know that from the research. I think that it's important that schools look at the data and then start studying their own practices. And I think a lot of reform can be done from within if a school community is committed to it. And if it's not, I mean, I think it's important that the federal government step in, whether it's the Federal Office of Civil Rights or Department of Education, to investigate those schools and to encourage those schools to adopt better practices, or state human relations commissions.
Well, those are all really good points, and I really appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise on this. And before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask, is there anything that I didn't ask that you wanted to mention or bring up?
I firmly believe that progress is possible. So I'm not, I don't hold sort of, I don't hold negative views about what is possible. I think progress is possible, But you have to be committed to actually working with kids, understanding them, understanding their families, and engaging the families in where possible in schools to be a part of the solution.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Harold, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to talk to us today, and I'm excited to possibly talk to you in the future as well.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the LDA podcast. To learn more about LDA and to get valuable resources and support, visit ldaamerica.org.